Imagine waking up and seeing water rising inside your house. It's not a puddle. It's not a flood. It's a flood that will rise more than 2 meters and won't recede for 5 years. Imagine that you can't leave. You can't escape. The city is an island surrounded by water, and the water is coming in. The rich flee by canoe. The poor climb to the attics. The dead float in the streets. The capital of New Spain, the most important city in the Americas, is drowning, and it will take 5 years to emerge. Welcome to Mexico City, 1629, the year the city that should have been the center of the world turned into a fetid lake. To understand what happened in 1629, you first need to understand where Mexico City was built. The Aztecs founded Tenochtitlan on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. They knew that water was a threat. They built dikes, aqueducts, control systems. The city survived for centuries, defying geography. What they had tamed with engineering and discipline, the Spanish undid in a few years. In 1521, Hernán Cortés ordered the destruction of the dikes that kept the lake under control. Without them, the city was exposed. The rains, which had previously been diverted, began to find their way through the streets. The lake, which had previously been kept at a distance, began to approach. But the decision to rebuild the capital in the same place was not geographical.
It was political. The Spanish wanted New Spain to be the direct successor to the Aztec Empire. They wanted to build on the ruins of the civilization they had destroyed. But the ruins also clogged the canals. The ground began to sink. The Spanish, with their stone architecture, sank faster than the Aztecs with their wooden and adobe constructions. In 1555, the first major colonial flood. In 1580, another. In 1604, the largest flood to date. In 1607, a flood so severe that the Spanish finally decided to act. They built the Tajo de Nochestongo, a tunnel almost 7 kilometers long to drain the city's water. It was the largest engineering work ever done in the Americas up to that point. But it wasn't enough. The water continued to accumulate. The city remained submerged. In September 1629, the city was already vulnerable. The Tajo de Nochestongo, the Great Drain, was under construction. Enrico Martinez, the engineer in charge, made a decision that would seal the city's fate. He ordered the closure of the drain's outlet to prevent rainwater from destroying the construction work. It was a logical decision. It was also a catastrophic decision. Between September 21st and 22nd, 1629, a torrential rain fell on Mexico City. The date coincided with the feast of St. Matthew, patron saint of tax collectors. Divine irony. It lasted almost 40 hours. The water, which had nowhere to go, began to rise, and rose, and rose. The water level reached more than 2 meters. The city that had been the pride of New Spain was submerged. What remained of the city was an island. Only the main square and some neighboring streets remained dry. Hundreds of dogs took refuge there. The survivors began to call the place Island of Dogs. Those who could fled by canoe. The poor, who did not have canoes, climbed to the second floors, to the attics, to the roofs. The adobe houses began to crumble. The collapse of the popular dwellings was devastating. Bodies began to float. The stench began to spread. The city, which had been the center of colonial power, was reduced to a refugee camp. The water didn't recede in days. It didn't recede in weeks. It didn't recede in months. Mexico City was submerged for 5 years. From 1629 to 1634, the capital of New Spain was an aquatic ghost town. The streets were rivers, the squares were lakes. People traveled by canoe. The wealthy, who had resources, fled to Puebla and other cities. Many Spanish families abandoned the capital. Of the 2,000 families that inhabited the city, only 400 remained. The city that had been the center of colonial power was being abandoned by the colonizers themselves. The viceroy, Rodrigo Pacheco y Osorio, Marquis of Cerralbo, tried to stem the exodus.
He distributed food, built wooden bridges, and organized masses on rooftops and balconies so that the faithful could hear from their homes. In an unprecedented gesture, the Archbishop authorized the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe to be transported by canoe from the basilica to the city center. It was an act of desperation and faith. But the viceroy's measures did not solve the problem. The water remained. The city remained submerged. The situation was so desperate that the viceroy even proposed moving the capital to another location, in a safer area, away from the lake. The idea was rejected by the city council. It would be more expensive to move the capital than to drain it. The decision was to stay and fight against the water. While the rich fled, the poor stayed. They had nowhere to go. They had no money to buy tickets. They had no relatives in other cities. They stayed in the flooded city, living in attics, on rooftops, anywhere the water didn't reach. Life was a daily struggle. Food was scarce. The drinking water was contaminated. Diseases spread. Indigenous neighborhoods were the most affected. Adobe houses crumbled under the water. Corpses floated through the streets. The Archbishop estimated that 30,000 indigenous people died. Other authors speak of 20,000 Spanish families, reduced to 400.
The city's population, which was around 150,000 people, was decimated. The survivors had to adapt. Canoes became the main means of transport. Masses were celebrated on rooftops and balconies. Markets were moved to the least affected areas, a measure that generated conflicts among merchants. The government tried to control the prices of corn and meat, which had skyrocketed due to the scarcity. The city, which had been the center of colonial power, was reduced to a camp of survivors. Those who could, prayed. Those who could not, died. Faith was the only fuel that remained, and even faith, in that submerged city, began to drown. In 1634, the water finally began to recede. Friar Andres de San Miguel, a Carmelite architect, was tasked with correcting the Nochistongo drainage system. He reworked Enrico Martinez's design and achieved what his predecessor had failed to do, the definitive removal of the water. The city, which had been submerged for 5 years, began to emerge. The streets reappeared, the houses were rebuilt, the markets reopened. People began to return. But the city that emerged was not the same one that had been submerged. The population had drastically decreased. The economy was in ruins. Confidence in the government was shaken. The city had survived, but the scar remained. The diseases that followed the flood killed thousands in the following years.
Famine, which had already been a constant companion, intensified. The city, which had been the pride of New Spain, was now a monument to human frailty. The lesson of the 1629 flood was not forgotten. Authorities began investing in more efficient drainage systems. The Huehuetoca drainage system was expanded and improved. The city, which had been built on water, learned to live with it. But the threat never completely disappeared. Mexico City, to this day, faces problems of flooding and soil subsidence. The water, which was contained in 1634, has never ceased to be a threat. Mexico City, 1629. The capital of New Spain, the most important city in the Americas, was submerged for 5 years. 30,000 people died. The rich fled. The poor lived in attics.
The government tried to contain the exodus, but could not contain the water. The city, which was built on the dreams of the Aztecs and the arrogance of the Spaniards, was swallowed by the lake that should have sustained it. What happened in Mexico City in 1629 was not just a natural disaster, it was a human disaster. The decision to build the capital in the middle of a lake was political, not geographical. The destruction of the dikes was reckless, not accidental. The closure of the drainage system was a mistake, not a fatality. The city was not a victim of nature, it was a victim of its own arrogance. Water is not the enemy, water is the mirror. What the city saw in 1629 was a reflection of its own choices, and what it saw was not beautiful. Today, Mexico City is a megalopolis of 20 million people. Water is still a threat. The ground still sinks. The rains still flood. The lesson of 1629 remains. The city that defied geography has never failed to pay the price. The 5 years underwater were a warning that perhaps has not yet been heeded.